what you do when you sing your phrase is you breathe the phrase. And so you actually know what it's going to sound like. It might be out of tune, it might be several things that you wouldn't like to hear, but you know what your breathing is going to be like and when you're playing a piece. That's a really important thing.
Welcome to the Bulletproof Musician Podcast, where you'll learn how to practice more effectively and perform better under pressure with insights from expert musicians and the latest research in performance psychology.
So my wife's a pianist, and when we were students, she also used to tease me about how few notes I actually had to play. Like if we were playing any Beethoven sonata, for instance, she'd point at my part, which had 5 pages and could fit inside my violin case alongside everything else that I was working on, whereas she'd be carrying around this small library of music, which required both arms to carry around.
Yes.
And so, like pianists, harpists have an awful lot of notes to learn also. And I get a lot of questions often about how to learn music. And it might seem like a really basic question, but especially for folks who have to learn lots of notes and fingers are in all different places, I was really curious to ask you, how do you learn all the notes?
I like to look at the whole piece and sort of get an idea of what it's like before I even go to the harp with it. Look at what the composer says, the feeling that he wants to convey for each section of the piece, especially for a long one. I like if there is a recording or other, several recordings, I certainly listen to them because we learn so much by ear as well, and it helps me to learn a piece if I already know what it sounds like, and I don't have to just be reading black spots on a page. I'm fortunate because I can hear in my head, so I can look at music and see what it's going to. I can sort of imagine what it will sound like by looking at it. And it gives me and I can also map out how I'm going to learn the piece. Is this going to take a lot of work in my left hand or a lot of work in the right hand? Am I going to be up here or down there? Or what's going to happen to my back while I'm doing this? All of these little things I figure out before I just sit down and start learning. I like to learn in my head first. And of course, then what I feel when I start to play is a different thing, and then it becomes an amalgamation of both things.
So it sounds like part of it is identifying the trickier spots, perhaps,
Yeah.
before you get to it.
Yeah. It depends on the music and how far I can go before it all feels like it's just not going to work. And learning the music, I decide ahead of time just how much I'm going to learn at once and how much I'm going to, I actually go through my music and I put the amount of measures I'm planning on learning, the phrases, I probably learn more by, depending on how simple it is, I learn by phrase or I learn by page or I learn by section or, it just depends on what is happening in that music. And this is a very personal thing, and I think with a lot of people it's that way. Some people, if they can, they'll listen, 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 and then everything makes sense to them, and they don't have to ask me how to learn it, and other people I have to, bar by bar, practice with them.
I'm curious what the learning process looks like for you. So you talked about phrase by phrase sometimes or section by section. I know it might seem like a really basic question, but I'm curious if I were a fly on the wall of your practice room, let's say that you're working on a new piece and you're going through some section of it, what would that look like?
Depends on the difficulty of the piece. If I can, I will play through a whole piece and get a feeling of it. However, some of the things are so difficult that I have to learn the notes before I can play through the piece. And, and my fingers have to become accustomed to what they're going to do before I can really get a good feel of how I'm going to practice it.
Can I ask what that note learning process looks like? Like, let's say it's a really difficult passage and you can't kind of play it through at tempo the first time. Like, how would you approach like breaking it down or getting it into your fingers?
Yeah, well, that's just the thing with the harp, too. We do get a feeling of what space we're working with, and we're able to play somewhat without looking at the strings. However, they're, I mean, you're not just working with your fingers, you're working with leaps, such as on the piano, which you can see exactly what you're doing. On the harp, we're working backwards and forwards, so we're working here and we're working there and we're leaning over. We're doing all sorts of manipulations that make it very difficult to just come down on the right note by feel. Sometimes we really have to look, especially in the upper register. This is the nitty gritty too with the harp is, of course, we have to change our accidentals with our feet, our sharps and our flats. And, if we change keys, sometimes we have to do 4 or 5 pedals at a time and try to make them as noiseless as possible and get ourselves into another key. And so that all takes planning, and that planning goes into the learning process. Okay, I'm going to change this pedal here. Does it interfere with something I just played? Is it going to make a squeak? Or when we change the pedals, it actually makes a tiny little sound with the mechanisms at the top of the harp. Is that going to be noisy? Do I have to muffle that string before I change the pedal? And sometimes 4 or 5 strings have to be muffled just to change one pedal. Or do I have to muffle the whole harp because I've got 3 or 4 pedals to change? The pedals are the thing with the harpist. We have to train our fingers, but boy, our feet have to be very, very skillful too to get what we're doing across without making it sound like a horrible mechanical manipulation.
It sounds like there's a lot of choreography involved between the hands and the feet. And like you were saying, the thinking ahead about what the consequences of changing the pedals at certain moments are going to be. I mean, is that something that, do you like write that out, or is it just something you intuit after a while, or do you have to do it slowly at first or experiment?
Always slowly, because every motion is so, I think with most instruments we have to practice, unless it's something so much within the realm of what we're used to doing, but especially with new music, slow, and every motion has to be and is subconsciously planned before you do it. When you're good at your instrument, you do these things without thinking about them. But still, the motion is the important thing of when it starts, when it ends, and what you're doing in between. It's all there.
You said something about the motions, and I know there's been some research on certain instruments where our perception as a listener of like how long a note was, for instance, is actually affected by the physical gesture of playing the note itself, whether, it's the length of the follow through or so forth. How much of that is something that you think about in terms of the playing of the harp?
How long it lasts is honestly, on the harp, there is a relationship between our fingers and our brain. How you press the string when you play it means a lot, whether it's pressed a lot or whether it's, a quick relay. Even how we lift our arms after we play a chord will say something about how long that chord will last and what kind of a color it will have. So there's a lot that just sort of happens. It starts in your brain and goes through your whole physical anatomy And I think it's probably that way with every instrument, because when you watch a violinist play and you watch several violinists play and see how each one has a different way of expressing the same thing, it's pretty amazing. And I think with the harp, it's the same thing. It's physically we respond to what we're hearing in our head and what we've put into our music. We physically respond to that.
I saw somewhere online where you were asked for the best advice you could give an aspiring harpist, and I'll, if it's okay, read back what your response was, because I wanted to explore it a little bit, if that's okay. So your response was focused practice, singing your phrases, counting your beats, awareness of what your body is telling you, and listening to yourself. Each of those sounds really intriguing and important and meaningful, and I wondered if we could go through each of them maybe a little bit and see what that looks like or what that meant.
Okay, I'm an old lady, so you're going to have to go one by one. First,
Absolutely, yes. So the first one was focused practice. What does that look like, or what does that mean?
oh yeah. Well, that means that you're not thinking about what you're going to have for dinner. We all know that. Or you're not thinking about, oh, I'd rather not be doing this. You have to focus on the positivity of learning something. And even if it's a piece you don't like, you have to say, okay, I may not like playing this, but something is going to happen to me that's good because I'm making sure I learn this. I think that helped me a lot in learning orchestral parts. Not that I didn't like the things that we played, but sometimes they're sort of boring. But just to be able to focus on maybe, well, what kind of a sound am I going to make? Do I want this to be soft? Certainly it has to be a centered sound, and that takes a little bit of effort. So you can always find something when you're learning a piece that will keep you engaged, because you think about what you want to get from that, even if it's something that you don't particularly like. There's something about it that you can improve yourself with.
It sounds like it goes back a little bit to what you said initially about learning, which is having a clear concept of it, even before you spend a lot of time working out some of the details.
I have been rather fortunate to have a good set of ears and I can hear in my head. And I have tried to, even with contemporary music, which gets really hard, but I try to at least get a feel before I even go to the harp of what this composer is trying to say. And of course, I mean, my ears aren't good enough to hear everything that the composer has written, especially in contemporary music. But I'm able to get a feeling by looking at what they've said as far as their directions for, you want this to be soft, you want this to be sweet, or, whatever, by their directions, and then looking at the notes and trying to gather them. It helps me before I even get to the harp to know what I'm going to be trying to do.
You said something about orchestra that I want to come back to later, but before we do that, the second piece of advice that you gave was singing your phrases. Can you say more about what that means or what that looks like?
Well, with my horrible voice, I sing them. That's all. That's what it looks like. And I won't demonstrate here. I'm sorry.
Right.
But it does help to sing them, because what you do when you sing your phrase is you breathe the phrase. And so you actually know what it's going to sound like. It might be out of tune, it might be several things that you wouldn't like to hear, but you know what your breathing is going to be like when you're playing a piece. And that's a really important thing.
So it sounds like it's not just about having a concept of how the phrase goes, but also like literally where you're going to be breathing within the phrase.
Not necessarily. I don't think that I breathe with the phrases when I play, but I know how long a phrase can be before you have to take a breath.
Gotcha.
It's a different thing, because I haven't checked myself, but I don't think I'm breathing with every phrase. In fact, sometimes
So by breathe, you mean almost more kind of figuratively.
yeah, it's a figurative thing, and it's really important to sort of plan in your music what you want it to sound like. You might be breathing 4 or 5 times before on an extra long phrase, but you want to have that feeling of beginning and opening up and then completion of the phrase, regardless of how often you're breathing while you're doing it. We're not singers.
Do you sing as you play in the practice room ever?
Yeah, I used to when I was a kid. I was yammering away all the time, singing as I was learning, and it did help me to learn. But now maybe because my voice is old and it sounds so horrible, I don't do that.
So the other question related to singing that I had, because it sometimes comes up with other instruments, is, for instance, I sometimes hear pianists not doing like a full-on Glenn Gould thing when they're playing, but you do hear them kind of humming to themselves a little bit.
Love that when with Glenn Gould, I love it. I love it. I love it when I hear him. It's so great.
Do you ever do anything along those lines, or at least maybe even if it's not audible, do you think vocally or like hear, audiate singing in your head as you're playing?
I think always in my head. Yeah. I think with most people, it's a general thing that what you're doing in your head is coming out through your instrument. Otherwise, it would just be a mechanical thing.
Which takes us to the third thing on your list, which is counting your beats. Can you say more about what you mean by that? Because I'm assuming that you don't mean like metronomically or just kind of ticking off the beats as you go, but so I'm curious what you mean by that.
I just count out loud. 1, 2, 3. 1 da da do 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 da 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 da. I mean, it's just in my head. The beats are always there.
Is this something that you practice in advance, or is it just something that happens naturally as you're learning?
I was taught to count when I was little, and in my head, I'm always counting. And then once I know a piece, you don't have to count it, but the beats are there.
Do you remember what the rationale was for when you were a kid,
I
when you
don't.
were taught?
Well, with my piano teacher, it was that I had to know where I was. I had to play in time. I had a very sweet little old man teaching me the piano, and it was a small town, and he was the one that everybody went to if they wanted a good piano teacher. And that was one of the things he drummed into me: count out loud, count, you know. And I still sometimes count out loud just to keep myself honest. And I think it's a wonderful thing to be always aware of the rhythm. Music makes no sense without that rhythm, without everything being in its place. And then once we know what place that's at, when we're playing a piece and we count it and we're strict with the rhythm, once we know where every beat is, then we can play with it. And everybody else will know too. We can be rubato. We can do things with that rhythm once you know what it is, and once you really pay attention to it, and not just think of it as being, beats, but as being an integral part of what the music is saying. I mean, it's all old stuff that everybody knows anyway. So
Sometimes I don't know that we necessarily do. What you're saying reminds me of something that I heard Leon Fleischer say once, which is that, between melody, harmony, and rhythm, he said that rhythm was by far the most important. from the tree. And
If you don't have rhythm, the melody it makes no sense, does it? Or
right.
harmony, especially the melody, though. The way it can move from one beat to the next, the way it can absolutely transform in one bar what's happening in the music, all of that, it has a place. That's what the composer put in there, a place for everything, a place for the harmony, a place for where it changes, a place for where suddenly you go a lot faster. Everything is in the beat. And so rhythm is very important.
Do you have any strategies for practicing rhythm or getting better at knowing where things fit into place?
Counting out loud, and we're lucky as harpists that we can, count out loud when we're playing. That's how I've always learned something. I count it out loud. Not so much anymore, I have to say, but always in my younger years when I was learning.
The way that you demonstrated earlier sounded almost like a combination of singing and counting.
Oh yeah, I used to sing everything I was learning.
Right.
Yeah. Sometimes way you wouldn't recognize it, but
The last two things that you had suggested as advice was awareness of what your body is telling you and listening to yourself. I wonder if you could elaborate on those a bit.
if you watch any musician play, you can see them mirroring in their body action what's going on in the music. Certainly, some do more, some do it much more, and some do it less. But if they're human beings, they're going to show what's going on in the music. I mean, if they're a computer, maybe not, but a person generally will show what's going on in the music. By a violinist by the way they move, a harpist by the shoulders, or even how they move their arms. There's something that shows physicality in what's happening in the music.
And it sounded also like there was a physical health component, perhaps, or a physical efficiency or effectiveness component as well.
Yeah. I'm almost 89 and I'm still able to play. And my back is working okay. And I think it's because of being aware of posture, but that's a different thing, of course. But also just being relaxed and enjoying what I'm doing, or just because I'm lucky, maybe.
Is it something you've ever had to learn or work on, or you've always been?
Yeah, my
quite good?
back, doing stretches and stuff like that. But honestly, I feel very fortunate that I'm still able to play. I've got arthritis in my fingers, of course, when you get to be this age. But playing is really good for that.
And the last thing was listening to yourself. And I'm curious about the listening to yourself because I think sometimes I don't think we really are listening to ourselves, or don't notice things that we need to. For instance, for me, one of my blind spots was rhythm. Like I was very focused on intonation and sound, but sometimes rhythmic things would just totally fly under the radar. The other part of it, though, I'm curious about is, sometimes we're listening to ourselves, but perhaps too evaluatively or too critically that we can't make any progress. And so I'm wondering what listening to yourself might have meant.
For me, it starts with what I want the sound to be for a particular note, even. It could be one note. And then I decide what finger I'm going to use for that note. And I mean, this happens a lot with the harp. Sometimes in an orchestra, you have one note to play, and it's very, very important, or one chord, and it's very important. So you have to visualize what you want to hear. You have to hear it first. I can't visualize what I want to hear, but you have to hear it in your head and then try to get that sound when I think everybody knows that, though. It's one of the things that a musician always does, is they have an idea of what they want to hear, and then they work until they hear what they want to hear. And it's that combination of the brain and the fingers or the arms or whatever working together that make the sound that they want to hear. And if they're not thinking about what they want to hear, then they're not going to be really playing at their top effort. They're not making the top effort unless they know what they want to hear and then try for it and hear it inside of themselves before they actually put it out there.
That's a good transition, I think, to the orchestra question that I was curious to ask you about. You mentioned how, sometimes you just have this one note, one chord in orchestra, and like out of nowhere, you have to make that really count. And I read something else you had said about how playing an orchestra, you were in the Toronto Symphony for decades, and you said that was one of your greatest teachers after, your actual physical teacher, Salcedo. And so I'm curious, you talked about how the challenges of orchestral playing helped in your solo playing, which then helped your orchestral playing, which then helped your solo playing, and just kind of went around and around. And that sounded really intriguing and terrific. And I'm wondering if you can say more about what that means or what that looks like or how you did that.
First of all, there's the great repertoire, playing Mahler, just bum 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 bum. That one little chord coming at the end of that phrase from, it was heaven for me just to be able to do that. I mean, and that's what playing an orchestra for a harp is. You sometimes end phrases, you sometimes begin them. You have to have the right feeling of why did the composer put the harp there in the first place? That was the sound he wanted. What sound did he want? I enjoyed that a lot.
I've sometimes been curious what people learn from other musicians who don't play their same instrument. Some of the things that I've found most useful, for instance, the thing Fleischer said about rhythm. I mean, I learned, I think, more about rhythm in some ways from pianists or other non-string players than I did from string players. And so if you think back to all these terrific colleagues that you've had and people that you've played with over the years, whether you studied with them, formally or not, what are some of the most enduring lessons that you've learned from non-harpists over the years?
My gosh, so much. Well, my husband was a trumpet player. I learned a lot from him about the ability to just come right out with it, and not to be afraid. In an orchestra, you only have a certain amount of time to make your point. And so when you, as a harpist, I would be afraid, and then I would hear my husband just, woo, there he is, and I would say, okay, if he can do it, and I'm just a little wee harp, I can do it too.
I read somewhere that you had said that there's more to teaching than just teaching the harp. And that reminded me a lot of a quote by the Chicago Bulls former coach Phil Jackson, who said something very similar to that, something about how, there's a lot more to basketball than basketball. And so I wondered if you could elaborate on that and say more what you might have meant.
Well, to me, harp is like I have a family. I have 4 children, and each one of them is very meaningful to me. And I have a really good family life. But the harp is my inner life, maybe. The music is the thing that I go to for enjoyment, physical activity. I think if I didn't have the harp, I wouldn't be me. It's just so much a part of me. The rest of my life is also a part of me, but it's totally different. The harp is something that I lose myself in, and music, but playing the harp is it's a physical but also a mental, and I would say it's a massage. you know
It sounds like you've had a really positive experience or positive relationship with the harp. I mean, was it always that way? Or because
Yeah.
you know how sometimes for some folks, if they're not having a good day, whether it's in the practice room or on stage, it starts to affect how they feel about themselves as a person. I wonder if it, and this is just a theory, I wonder if it has anything to do with the way in which you critique yourself. I mean, how do you maintain such high standards, but in a way that doesn't beat yourself up, if that makes sense?
Well, I keep my technique going, because if you don't have a good technique, you can't do anything. You can't make a good sound. You can't play what's on the page. I mean, the important thing is the sound you're making, whether you're playing fast, whether the technical things, or if you're playing, I mean, everything has to be heard. So I keep my listening skills, hopefully, at a very high point. And as I said, yeah, I'll take a day off from practicing, but I'm never, ever more than a week away from a harp, you know. And it's a pleasure for me. That's all.
And when it comes to maintaining technique, you know, not being a harpist, I have no idea what that looks like for the harp. Maybe other harpists already know, but
I
what would
don't
that look like for you on a day-to-day basis?
I don't do exercises. I don't do any technique. I just figure out what pieces will give me this, what pieces will give me that, and that's what I work on. I used to, if I weren't working on pieces, then I had a whole 45 minutes of exercises a day that I would do. But now, in my semi-retirement, I just pick out pieces I want to work on, and they're always something that will have a little bit of technique in it that I feel that I need to work on, and I just do that. And teaching, I have to keep up my technique in order to teach, because I have to demonstrate.
The last thing that I'm curious about related to practicing, this is something that a reader asked if I could start asking everybody. And so I thought you would be the first person to get this question. And it's, if you had only 20 minutes to practice today, what would you do?
Scales. Only 20 minutes? Maybe, yes, I would. Yes, because if it's only one day, I might do scales, but I'd probably finish off with something, a piece, but a short piece, you know. Maybe, you know, that comes to mind. 2 minutes, it's done, but you've done something musical, you know.
And actually with scales, what would your focus be on scales, or how would you practice scales?
I do them with rhythms. I do them in da 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 da, back and forth, so that I get all of them. But I don't do them that much anymore. I just have fun.